topic of the Kiithid system used by the Hiigaran-Kushans has already been covered previously. However, since then, a new wealth of information has been put out there by the Homeworld writers, mainly through the Homeworld Revelations RPG core book. As the Kiithid system is such a major cultural binding force of the Hiigaran-Kushans, it needs to be covered again with the revised and updated details that's now available. So, without further ado, the origin of the Kiithid social system dates back to before the Hiigaran exile, with its exact origins being lost to time. It did survive the long exodus from Hiigara to Kaarak, and then back again to Hiigara during the Kushan exodus over the course of the Homeworld War. The Kiithid system, much like the Guide Stone, the engraved galactic map leading to Hiigara, is perhaps the longest-standing relic of Hiigaran-Kushan history, and various references to the modern Kiithid of Kaarak could be seen in the halls of the Kar-Toba, the transport ship that brought the Kushan to Kaarak. A Kiith itself is a collection of families under one banner. The leading family, or Kiith Sa, was traditionally the one with the eldest members. At some point though, it became the family with the most power, wealth, and/or influence. The head of the Kiith Sa family is given the title of Sa. So for example, the individual head of the Somtaaw Kiith would have his first name, followed by his Kiith name with the honorific of Sa added to the end of it. For example, Chad Somtaaw Sa. Below the Kiith Sa family is a second family that operates as moderators and administrators for the other families in the Kiith. All the other Kiithid below them are roughly grouped with the same category, with some families in this group having higher standing and prestige over others. This power dynamic is far from unmoving, and a Kiith's internal politics can change frequently due to a singular family's accomplishments, or them leaving the Kiith entirely to forge new alliances with other Kiith, or to create a Kiith of their own if their numbers are large enough. The basic structure of a Kiith has not changed for thousands of years. However, there have been two documented cases where the Kiithid system was amended or upheaved entirely. The first took place in those early centuries on Kaarak. As the Kushan were struggling to survive on their new world, an additional option became popular for the various Kiithid: vassalage. Being able to exist, much less thrive on Kaarak, had no guarantees. A smaller Kiith could pledge their allegiance to a larger Kiith to aid in their goals of survival, while still retaining at least some autonomy and land rights. This vassal system was unfortunately abused maliciously during the Heresy Wars, where Kiith Siidim and Gaalsien fought over their specific religious beliefs in a conflict lasting for over 300 years. Both sides squeezed their vassal Kiith for all they were worth, pushing them to the breaking point and beyond. Fortunately, this vassal system was abolished when Kiith Naabal emerged from their hidden city stronghold of Tyr, and brought an end to the Heresy Wars with their relatively advanced technology. Afterwards, the Naabali would then lead the creation of the first Kaarakid Diamid, a place where all of the Kiithid could gather and debate their issues in a public forum without the need for bloodshed. The Diamid stood the test of time all the way up to the burning of Kaarak, and after the Homeworld War, the Kushans would quickly re-establish a new Diamid upon Hiigara, with its last recorded mention being at the time of the Incarnate War hundreds of years later. Although, the idea of vassalage did reappear after the Kushan landfall in Hiigara, when Kiith Sigald became vassals of Kiith S'Jet. On that topic, the second change to the system was a massive upending of the power dynamics between the Kiithid that stemmed from the burning of Kaarak and the events of the Homeworld War. In one planet-killing fireball, suddenly a healthy population of 300 million was cut down to 600,000, with even more being lost on the journey to Hiigara. By the time the war was over and the Kushan set foot on their homeworld again, the Kiithid political landscape was completely changed. As the representation of the Kiithid aboard the mothership was not even, some formerly powerful Kiithid were humbled greatly, while others found themselves with far greater power than they ever had before. That is most of what is known about the Kiithid system as a whole. However, no two Kiith are the same, and it would be a severe misjudgment to believe that the only thing that makes each Kiith different are their names and sigils. No, each one is a unique group with their own culture, traditions, beliefs, and philosophies about the world around them. And what better way to start our coverage of the different Kiithid than with the one Kiith that had one of the most prominent impacts on Kushan history during their internment on Kaarak: Kiith Gaalsien. Arguably the most infamous of Kiithid, the Gaalsien were a powerful force during the start of the Hiigaran-Kushans' forced stay on Kaarak, the Heresy Wars, and all the way up until the conclusion of Operation Kadim, which discovered the Car Toba, the transport ship that brought the Kushan to Karak, as well as the first city upon landfall. Their power was presumably cut to the bone after the death of their leader, the Kiith S'Jet, along with a large number of their forces during the last battle of Operation Kadim. But why did the Gaalsien do what they did? The answer is straightforward. They were religious zealots. The Kushans all believed in S'Jet, the Great Maker, but how they believed in him differed wildly between individuals and the other Kiithid. The Kushan of Kiith Gaalsien took a very rigid and hardline stance in their beliefs about the Great Maker. They believed that S'Jet was a harsh god who punished the Kushan people for some unknowable sin, and were banished from paradise in order to suffer on the harsh desert world of Karak, until S'Jet believed them to be worthy of returning to paradise. Until then, the Kushan people were to adhere to strict guidelines and tenets, along with a code of behavior known as the Decree of Ka'a, that was to prove themselves to the Great Maker. Any deviation from this was considered an act of hubris, or heresy, and would make the Kushan stay on Karak even longer than it needed to be, according to the Gaalsien. The Decree of Ka'a itself, in the general sense, is actually a set of rules for surviving on Karak but wrapped with the gravity of religion and law. There is not much available documentation on the Decree of Ka'a, but it did specifically forbid particular actions which were excessively using resources, taking risks on unproven methods, placing the individual over the needs of the greater Kiith, hoarding or keeping precious items from others, and challenging the status quo. These rules are perhaps understandable when survival in the harsh environment of Karak is not guaranteed, especially in those early days after landfall. However, when their influence began to diminish as the Kushan migrated from their equatorial landing site to the more temperate areas in northern Karak, the Gaalsien were not pleased. And thus the Gaalsien chose to initiate the Heresy Wars, the single greatest conflict in the known history of Karak, lasting for over 300 years, until Kiith Naabal put an end to it with their superior technology. Near the end of the Heresy Wars in 717 KDS, instead of acknowledging their pending defeat, the Gaalsien chose to destroy the holy temple city of Saju-Ka and flee into the desert. There they stayed, believed to have gone extinct by the other Kiithid. They would not re-emerge again until 1075 KDS, sporting advanced weapons salvaged from crashed spaceships they had found in the desert. The reason why they had returned was, unsurprisingly, due to their beliefs. According to the Gaalsien, the Northern Kiithid's experiments in spaceflight were an affront to S'Jet, and threatened to bring down his wrath on all Kushan. Thus, in their eyes, the Northern Kiithid had to be stopped, by force if need be, to avoid extinction. The Gaalsien would initially start with propaganda campaigns that then escalated to open warfare against the other Kiithid until the conclusion of Operation Kadim, which ended in a climactic battle for the Car Toba between the Gaalsien and the Northern Coalition of Kiithid, resulting in the utter defeat of the Gaalsien and the destruction of their leader, the Kiith S'Jet. After the discovery of the Car Toba, the Gaalsien continued to gather their strength and work behind the scenes and sabotage the other Kiithid's work on the Mothership Project. In fact, the Mothership's first hyperspace test, the one that led to the burning of Karak, was actually pushed up the schedule to thwart any Gaalsien sabotage. However, after the burn, it was believed the Gaalsien were completely wiped out along with the rest of the Karakian population. But it's not outside the realm of possibility if the Gaalsien snuck a number of sleeper agents aboard the Mothership as they made their journey. Kiith Paktu. The Paktu were incredibly unique and fiercely independent among the other Kiithid of Karak, owing much to the dangerous trek they took to the south of Karak to escape the tyranny of Kiith Siidim and the zealotry of Kiith Gaalsien. When they reached the southern pole, they still maintained their traditions and values as a farming Kiith, which involved the celebration of the seasonal harvest and the high regard placed in an honest day's work. The Paktu are also dreamers, looking to the future and valuing instant gratification, which is a stark contrast to other Kiithid who generally value continuity, tradition, and deep thought. But the most glaring difference between Kiith Paktu and their compatriots in the north is their prolific atheism that runs through their society. While Paktu does not forbid worship of S'Jet, there is no central organization in the worship of S'Jet or any other god. The topic of religious belief in itself is considered to be best done in private. Perhaps memories of the Heresy Wars and the actions of the Siidim and the Gaalsien have left a long-lasting imprint on Kiith Paktu as a people. As to why the Paktu are the way they are, their history provides most of these answers. It all began before the year of 462 KDS, when Kiith Siidim began to adopt what was known as the traditional Siidim cosmology, which stated that all other Kiithid were Grittidim, or sand people, as they were born on Khaaneph. The Siidim, on the other hand, believed that they were of divine origin, making the other Kushan lesser beings. Their most infamous policy in these ancient times was the Clean Water Act, which forbid any non-Siidim from living upstream of any Siidim holding that lived near a river or stream. The Siidim rationale being that the Grittidim would taint the waters with their desert blood. By 488 KDS, Kiith Paktu were among those forced to flee from their traditional homes due to this policy, but the next biggest Kiith, the Gaalsien, provided them no mercy either, as unfortunately by this time the heresy wars between the Siidim and the Gaalsien began to be set into motion, forcing every Kiithid to take a side. The Paktu saw Majir Paktu was dissatisfied by having to pledge allegiance between one harsh tyrant or another, and instead chose a third option for his people: an exodus. The Paktu built great sand sailors to cross Khaaneph and reach the south, where it was rumored that there was arable land suitable for habitation. There was no guarantee that a better life awaited them in the south, but Majir pressed on, and by 490 KDS, 50 Kiithid set sail and began their journey. The exodus was fraught with peril and hardship, and by the time they reached the Hunan Mountains in the south, only 17 Kiithid were left. More perished as they climbed the mountain range, with despair beginning to settle inside those firsters. Sensing the emotions of his band, Majir Paktu said to them a line that would forever live on in Paktu history: "I can smell the sea. It's only a little farther." His Kiith mates were not swayed, and began the trek back down to their sand sailors. But that was when a bird chose to appear in the sky, which many believed to be a sea spirit, and so the Paktu survivors chose to follow the bird, eventually leading them to a vast body of water that was quickly named the Majirian Sea by a presumably grateful Kiith Paktu. From the first landings up until 700 KDS, the Paktu would continue to build their holdings, eventually creating a prosperous civilization for themselves. The Siidim and the Gaalsien would make 3 attempts during this time to claim these southern lands for themselves, all failing spectacularly. During the last attempted invasion, the Paktu saw himself at the time, Kiith Paktu, met the invasion personally and proclaimed to their would-be oppressors, "These are my people, and this land is ours. You have no power here." As time marched on, the heresy wars ended, and the northern Kiithid of Khaaneph would make proper diplomatic contact with Kiith Paktu. At first, trade and communication was facilitated by tradesmen and sailors from Kiith Manaan acting as intermediaries, but eventually the Kiith Paktu would have a seat on the Diamid, the ruling council of all Kushan. However, they only ever maintained a token presence there. The affairs of the north held little interest to the southern Kiithid, but this changed by 1024 KDS. By then they were leaders in the burgeoning attempts of the Kushan at spaceflight, maintaining the largest rocket base in all of Khaaneph. From there they eventually became key contributors to the Mothership project by helping to launch heavy equipment into orbit. By the time of the Mothership launch, the Paktu remained fiercely independent. Even after the landfall in Hiigaran and the end of the Homeworld War, Kiith Paktu demonstrated their ability to go against the order of things by establishing an opposing coalition to Kiith Naabal, which had become the de facto ruling power in the new Hiigaran Diamid. Thanks to Kiith Paktu arguing on behalf of the rights of the individual, many Kiithid who had their numbers decimated were able to retain their status as independent groups, and avoid being absorbed by the larger Kiithid. It is said that when the situation is bleak and all hope has seemingly left them, a Paktu can often be found saying, "I can smell the sea." Kiith Soban. The Sobani are the elite warriors of the Kushan, a Kiith solely dedicated to the art of war and strategy. They are unique in the sense that no one is born as a Sobani. They must willingly choose to become part of Kiith Soban themselves. As such, their members are often those who are often fleeing from their former Kiith, or those who have committed serious taboos or crimes and simply have nowhere else to go. Upon their entrance into the Kiith, prospective members are to undertake a ceremony called Taking the Red, where a person is to kneel in front of the Soban saw and rip off the colors and ties to their previous Kiith, symbolizing that they are joining the Sobani free of any past obligation. Then they are joined with other new members, forming a small family unified by their duty to the Kiith. Often, the Sobani contract themselves out as mercenaries, ranging from simple security guards to soldiers, and even strategic consultants. They are notorious for being strict adherents to whatever contract they sign. There are even stories that when a contract deadline has been reached, down to the minute and second even, that the Sobani simply take off their hiring Kiith's colors and return home. Contracts can't be extended either, at least not without negotiation in advance with the Soban Sa. A Soban family is simply called a unit, owing to their martial traditions presumably. However, their organization is the same as a family. A Sa at the top of the hierarchy, a second to handle administrative duties, followed by the rest of the unit. Like a regular family, the Sobani are allowed to form relationships in the general sense with whomever they want when off duty. But unlike a regular family, if two Sobani wish to marry and/or have children, they are forced to leave Kiith Soban entirely. Such involved practices and dedication to martial prowess are often based on a history rife with conflict and strife, and in the case of the Soban, this is very much the case. In 416 KDS, Kiith Kaalel, a particularly violent Kiith, raided the shores of the Western Sea. The smaller Kiithid inhabiting the area fought hard, but this only incensed the Kaalel to greater atrocities, eventually resulting in the desecration of several taboos in Kushan society, and the murder of a terrifying amount of men, women, and children. The few survivors managed to flee to tell their liege lord, the Kiith Lehi Sa, what had transpired. The Sa of the survivors, Soban, demanded to lead a reprisal raid against their attackers for these horrifying atrocities. Soban and his people wanted revenge and to teach the Kaalel the error of their ways. When he was finished speaking with the Lehi Sa, Soban took his people into the sparkling desert to await the Lehi reinforcements. But they never came. The Lehi Kiith Sa was too afraid of the Kaalel. When Soban realized this, he was outraged and tore the colors of Lehi from his body, with his followers doing the same, symbolizing the abandonment of their Kiith, which was considered a radical idea at the time. To Soban, the word Kiith meant nothing if it turned a blind eye to the suffering of dying children. From then on, the only Kiith that had any merit was not one of blood, but one in spirit. A brotherhood. Taking on a new color, a deep red, Soban took his people and attacked the Kaalel occupying their homelands. And by the time the new Sobani were finished, it was said that not one stone was left standing on top of another, nor was there a single blade of grass left green. In their first act as a Kiith, the Sobani had already established themselves as warriors without peer. From that point on, Kiith Soban would take part in every major conflict on Karak, as mercenaries, their reputation making them prized and expensive agents for the highest bidder. By the time of the launch of the Mothership project, the whole of Karak was mostly at peace, but the Sobani continued their martial traditions by being hired as intelligence or security officers, though their most prominent role is seen through the running of their elite Soban military academies, which are open to the public, for the right price of course. Every admiral or general serving in the Kushan forces by the time of the Mothership launch had been trained at a Sobani institution. During the Homeworld War, the Sobani epitomized the attitude of professionals under fire, with their unerring discipline in the numerous combat encounters the Kushan fleet found themselves in. Once they had reached Hiigara, Kiith Soban took it upon themselves to become the defenders of their long-lost homeworld, and began building up their standing forces for such a difficult task. But after some time, the Sobani, true to their mercenary ways, found themselves once again contracting out their services as soldiers and tacticians. Instead, this time, they marketed themselves to the greater galactic community. Kiith S'Jet. The burning desire to discover the truth of the world around them is a core tenet of the S'Jet, and this is reflected by the number of world-shattering scientific discoveries they have made throughout Kushan and known Hiigaran history. For example, astral calculations found within the Kartoba upon the discovery of the Guide Stone can actually be attributed to the former S'Jet residents of the Kartoba directly. Even the Karakian dating system, the means to keep time during the Kushans' exile on Karak, was created by Kiith S'Jet scholars who were able to chart the path of the other planets in the Karak system. But their most monumental work, besides the Mothership Project, was the creation of the exogenesis theory, which led to the discovery that the Kushan were not of Karak, which then led to the finding of the Kartoba, the Guide Stone, the Hyperspace Core, and eventually the creation of the Kushan Mothership herself. All of this stems from Kiith S'Jet's culture of intense study and deep internal thought. An interesting comparison between the other Kiithid and the S'Jet is that while most members of a certain Kiith collectively focus on one field of expertise, like the Soban for military and the Somtaaw for mining, individual members of Kiith S'Jet are encouraged to study and master a single field of expertise. And when taken as a whole, the entire Kiith is very broadly educated in a wide manner of areas. But besides their predilection for scientific discovery and advancement, the members of Kiith S'Jet are also skilled and detailed record keepers, and often find work as legal judges. Their reputation for such matters was so great that it actually rivaled that of Kiith Soban, due to a typical S'Jet's penetrating questions during cross-examination. On the other hand, S'Jet members also have a tendency to withhold the truth in how it's delivered. While S'Jetis is believed to never lie, they have been known to go to great lengths to tell the truth in a way that hides a certain aspect they wish to keep from being exposed. The S'Jet have always been a figure in the history of Karak, typically behind the scenes as the major players charted, or attempted to chart the course of the Kushan people. In the ancient times on Karak during the Heresy Wars, Kiith Siidim and Gaalsien were not particularly fond of them, while the Siidim mostly left the S'Jeti alone, except for when they would create a publication that painted them in a negative light. The Gaalsien were far more belligerent, going so far as to sack a city under the control of Kiith S'Jet. The biggest scandal that the S'Jet ever found themselves in was after the Heresy Wars during the era known as the Time of Reason. At some point it was discovered that certain S'Jeti families swore a secret oath to Kiith Naabal, allowing for Naabali scholars to masquerade as S'Jeti to recover and preserve knowledge that would have been destroyed in the name of blasphemy. Kiith Naabal were forced to do this as the S'Jet generally had an unspoken immunity to prosecution, as any such action would involve other Kushan science philosophers to shun the prosecuting Kiith for no less than 100 years. By allowing for Naabali scholars to pretend at being S'Jeti, regardless of the nobility of their goals, went against the S'Jet philosophy of adhering to the truth in wherever it led. While the scandal almost divided Kiith S'Jet, they were able to rally under the pleas and arguments of their leader, Fleer S'Jet Saw, and stay together. However, relations with Kiith Naabal would be permanently icy and distant. Even by the time of the Kushan landfall centuries later, this relationship stayed mostly the same. During the Kartoba era of 1106 to 1216 KDS, the S'Jet would become visible leaders in the investigation of the primary anomaly, which was discovered to be the Kartoba, the ship that brought the Kushan to Hiigaran, their first city on the desert world. Thanks to the collective efforts of Operation Kadim and Chief Science Officer Rachel S'Jet, the Kartoba was found, the Gaalsien Kiith Saw was killed, Siddim's attempted treachery against the other Kiithid was exposed, and conclusive proof was found that the Kushan people were actually not of Karak, but came from elsewhere beyond the stars. Then there was the eventual finding of the Guide Stone, which provided a map to Hiigara, and afterwards, this monumental series of events would be overshadowed with the finding of the Hyperspace Core, making intergalactic travel possible. After these world-shattering events, the Kushan would begin work on the Mothership Project, where a giant spacecraft would be constructed that would take a number of Kushan on a long and dangerous journey to reunite with their lost homeworld. But during development, it was realized that command and control of such a massive ship and its supporting fleet would be utterly impractical with conventional methods. That's when neuroscientist Karen S'Jet proposed a radical solution. Use a living being as the central command authority and have their brain directly linked to the mothership data shunts, as only a Kushan brain could make the judgment calls with the speed and clarity needed for the unpredictable scenarios that could await the mothership, whereas the supercomputer of the time or supercomputers could not. This had its own risks, however. Her method was potentially dangerous, untested, and far from perfected. It could very well kill anyone chosen to act as the Mothership Command Core. So, unwilling to let anyone else shoulder the risk, Karen performed the operation on herself and became more than just a S'Jeti scientist. She became Kushan Fleet Command. Due in large part to Kiith S'Jet's role as fleet command during the Homeworld War, the S'Jeti star rose to new heights in the new political landscape of the Hiigaran Diamid. While Kiith S'Jet did not take charge like Kiith Naabal did after the Hiigaran landfall, S'Jet's influence was substantial, and both Karen and her Kiith made sure to not abuse this new power. As for Kiith S'Jet, she would retire briefly on Hiigara for a time, mostly living in seclusion. Somehow, the process of being interfaced directly with the Kushan mothership during the Homeworld War extended her life greatly, and by the time of the Vagar War, she was able to return to her role as fleet command without any of her abilities or faculties worn down by age. This time, leading the new Hiigaran mothership, the Pride of Hiigara, she led the Hiigarans to victory over the Vagar, and in the course of doing so, she and her people were able to unlock a vast progenitor hyperspace network that ushered in a period of prosperity that came to be known as the Age of S'Jet. This lasted until the Incarnate War, where at the end of that conflict, Karen disappeared. Aside from that, Kiith S'Jet continued the roles they were best known for back on Karak, finding the truth of everything. Kiith Naabal. The stewards of knowledge and the saviors of the Kushan people from the madness that was the Heresy Wars. Modern Kushan society by the time of the mothership launch owed them a great deal. But for the Naabal themselves, they are a modest, pacifist people who would much rather focus on building the future rather than relive the glory of a past war they did not want to fight in the first place. Kiith Naabal is often dedicated to technical works or engineering mastery, as it is said that what truth is to the S'Jet, the future of Kushan civilization is to the Naabal. In fact, some of their great feats include the Stormbreak Barrier, which held off the relentless sands of Karak from encroaching on the last habitable land in the north for a time, and the Great Northern Way, the steam car line between the northern Kiithid and the Paktu in the southern hemisphere. Naabal engineers were also credited with making great contributions to the major components of the Kushan mothership, and the great scaffold that was used to create said mothership. The family groupings of Kiith Naabal are often based upon which engineering trade the families choose to specialize in. This has also given these groups the power to leave Naabal and form their own Kiith, but many more family groups choose to stay and help keep the Naabal strong in the face of competition with the other Kiithid. Curiously though, the number of Kiith Naabal members in cryogenic suspension for the Mothership project are slightly higher than that of other Kiith. Some could even say that perhaps the Naabal were using their engineering expertise on the Mothership project to ensure more of their members were selected for the Great Journey. After all, alongside their noble feats of engineering and civilization building, the Naabal are often known for subtly influencing Kiithid policies through behind-the-scenes methods and certain financial investments. Mysteriously, little is known about the history of Kiith Naabal before their entrance into the Heresy Wars. The few documented records of the ancient era of Karak only speak of them in reference to either tradesmen or heretics. Kiith Gaalsien, like with many other Kiithid, often singled out the Naabali to be persecuted by them on the grounds of heresy. This belligerent stance towards Kiith Naabal is actually believed to have been the cause of their migration and eventual settling to their hidden valley city of Tyr. There they maintained a purely isolationist stance, ignoring the rest of the world even as the Heresy Wars erupted and dragged the entirety of Kushan society into its violent madness. But the Naabali were not without compassion. Any Kiith or group of people who found their way to Tyr to flee the never-ending conflict were welcome among the Naabal to begin their lives again. And while Kiith Naabal were firmly isolationists, they would on occasion send out small parties to recover knowledge or texts that were under threat of being destroyed in the numerous battles between Kiithid. Sometimes these recovery missions even involved the rescue of scholars who were accused of dealing in heresy. But things changed when Nefrit Naabal saw rose to prominence and began to loosen Naabal's isolationist philosophies. This was because Nefrit came to a stark realization. The Heresy Wars were actually jeopardizing the survival of all Kushans. The unending conflict was destroying crop fields, dams, and sand traps to keep out the encroaching desert, among other vital infrastructure. And with no end to the war in sight, the end of Kushan civilization was a distant, but unignorable reality. Intervention was the order of the day. Fortunately for Kiith Naabal, much of their knowledge and scholarly texts they smuggled to their isolated valley city of Tyr could have direct military application. Some of this knowledge was gunpowder, explosives, steam power, and metal refining, so when Kiith Naabal began to place his Kiith on a war footing, they quickly had a substantial military outfitted with relatively advanced weaponry in only a few years. It is said that when they rose from their hidden valley to end the heresy wars, they swept across the land like the gleaming servants of Jakul himself. Armored Naabali soldiers using repeater rifles and cannon were able to easily outmatch armies that were 20 times their size. And at each holding and settlement they liberated, Ifrit would speak to the people there, where he offered Naabali science and knowledge if they just put down their arms and stop the endless fighting. Ifrit did not even demand they renounce their Kiith ties as was his right. He simply wanted the Kushans to stop killing each other and end these wars. Many of the lesser Kiithid, brutalized and exhausted by 300 years of conflict, quickly joined the Naabal, and their armies eventually grew to over 50 times their original strength. Apparently, many Kushan were as tired of the war as Kiith Naabal was. Finally, 3 years after they set out from Tyr, the Naabal had ended the heresy wars. With his goals achieved, Kiith Naabal would contribute one last thing to the greater Kushan society: the formation of the Diamid, a place where the Kiithid of Kaarak could come together and dictate the course of their people and resolve disputes without the need for bloodshed. In the time leading up to the launch of the Kushan mothership, the Naabali were generally content to step back and let the other Kiithid continue the work of leading the Kushan people that Kiith Naabal had started all those years ago in the aftermath of the heresy wars. That all changed with the burning of Kaarak. When the Homeworld War was over and the Kushan were finally able to process what had happened to them as a people, the Naabali realized they had to reclaim their role as societal architects and lead their people again. The first thing they did was help to establish a new Diamid on Hiigara, but what they did next years after landfall caused far more division among many Kiithid and may have tarnished their image greatly. The Naabali leader, Atarl Naabal, argued in the Diamid that those Kiithid who were suffering from low numbers due to the burning of Kaarak be absorbed into the Naabal ranks for the good of the greater Kushan people. Atarl Naabal had wanted to nurture the growth of their new society on Hiigara, but many others, including Kiith Paktu and Somtaaw, argued that it was nothing but a blatant power grab, especially Somtaaw, as they were one of the depleted Kiithid that Naabal wanted to absorb. It can be assumed that this notion was defeated in the new Diamid as Kiith Somtaaw remained independent by the time of the Beast War, but whether any Kiithid at all were brought into the Naabali ranks is not known. Kiith Manaan. Travelers, rogues, scoundrels. All terms used to describe this Kiith that was landless on Kaarak due to their constant nomadic tendencies and refusal to put down roots. In the ancient times on Kaarak, the Manani would travel the desert stopping by the different settlements of each Kiith. In return for hospitality, Kiith Manaan would provide rare and exotic items from afar, and perhaps even more precious, entertainment. Kaarak, as has been stated before, was a harsh and unforgiving planet, and it was thankless, tiring work to be able to eke out a living in those ancient times. After a hard day's work, there was no energy that could be spared for such frivolities as finding exotic goods or preparing for celebrations to remind oneself that life is more than just endless toil and sweat. Which is where Kiith Manaan comes in. Often when they were in sight of a settlement, everyone knew that a festival was soon to come. But not everyone trusted the Manani. In a time where even basic existence required hard work, Kiith Manaan was often treated by many as a threat to proper morals and decency for the Kushan youth, as the Manani simply moved from place to place depending on the goodwill and charity of others. These attitudes mattered little to Kiith Manaan, for the most part. As time went on, the Manani desire for new experiences and adventure took them to new heights. Literally. They were often seen sailing the old sand ships of Kaarak, driving the first ground vehicles and steam cars, and eventually piloting airplanes and even spacecraft. But not all of Manaan's members would pursue such exciting careers. After the heresy wars, they found themselves wealthy due to their trade connections. As a result, many Manani would become politicians, administrators, and diplomats, while others, true to their ancient roots as entertainers, would become artists and actors. The earliest mention of Kiith Manaan in Kaarak's history was in 340 KDS, when certain Kiith of the White Desert accused the Manani from stealing from their Saw. This was, unfortunately, to be the start of their stereotype as thieves and threats to the common values and decency of the greater Kushan society. Upon scrutiny, though, the White Desert claim seemed dubious, as it was claimed that the Manani had gotten away with nearly a ton of food and a very large quantity of water, which just happened to be the exact amount of tribute they owed their Kiith Saw for that year. Later on, accusations of witchcraft and sorcery were added to their reputation, due to the Manani's ability to sneak illicit goods past the most scrutinous of security checks. When the Heresy Wars erupted, Kiith Manaan was often the target of brutal treatment by the Gaalsien and Siidim. The freewheeling, light-hearted take on life of the Manani were the polar opposites of their strict and inflexible doctrines. In fact, one of the few things both Kiithid could agree to was that the Manani were abominations to S'Juk. But one day, Kiith Siidim would take their hatred too far. Every year, Kiith Manaan would gather in a specific location and host the Faran Shah Festival. It was a week-long celebration of revelry and Super Saiyan-level college frat boy drinking. As most, if not all of the Kiith would be there, fighting was strictly forbidden, and outsiders were, on occasion, allowed to participate. Kiith Siidim found the location of the Faran Shah Festival of the year 513 KDS. During the celebrations, the Siidim sent in their armies and slaughtered the partygoers in the bloodiest of massacres. This act so outraged the surviving members of Kiith Manaan that they took up their swords and desert sailors and became pirates. The holdings of Kiith Siidim would live in terror of the new threat that their leadership unwittingly created for the next 100 years. Even the sight of a mast on the horizon was cause for a moment of terror. But by 656 KDS, Kiith Manaan announced that their war against the Siidim was at an end. Their bloodlust had been satiated. Afterwards, they rebuilt a new dancing ground in the southern hemisphere where Kiith Paktu resided, and turned their pirate fleet back into honest traders. Kiith Manaan would continue their existence as merchants and traders well up until the mothership launch. The Manani in general were always quick to adopt new technological advances, especially in the fields of travel and general vehicles. In fact, the first air passenger service on Karak was flown by Kiith Manaan, and the first spaceflight was achieved by Naju Manaan aboard a rocket he made himself. Granted, he didn't survive the attempt, but instead of serving as a warning to his people, it instead spurred them on to keep reaching for the stars. During the Homeworld War, it was quickly realized that the Kushans needed an ambassador after their first violent encounter with the Tyrannics. One of the Manani, Jeremiah Manaan Saw, the son of the Kiith Saw back on Karak, volunteered for the position. In much the same way his people did between the northern and southern Kiithid of Karak, Jeremiah facilitated, or tried to facilitate, diplomatic relations on behalf of the Kushan survivors. After the end of the Homeworld War and the Hiigaran landfall, as the other Kiithid began settling into their new lives on Hiigara, the Manani did the opposite. Ever the nomads, they moved to create and maintain a larger-than-average space fleet, and even began the earliest galactic Kushan trade network by themselves. When Kiith Naabal tried to absorb the weaker Kiithid into themselves, Manaan stood with Paktu and Somtaaw to resist the takeover. Also true to their history, the Manani readopted their roles as mediators and intermediaries between the Kiithid and the new Hiigaran political landscape. Kiith Somtaaw. Once they were one of the great religious Kiithid of Karak, but over time, they became a powerful and unbreakable clan of miners and explorers. While they did become far more rational and logical by the time of the modern era of Karak and beyond, they never did completely forsake their faith. Their combination of their history as a religious Kiith, along with their roles as miners, has led to the people of Kiith Somtaaw to be renowned for their hard-working and tireless attitudes and dedication to overcoming any problem that might stymie their path. To those who remain dedicated to the worship of S'Juk, many Somtaaw saw their daily struggles as a way to prove to the Great Maker that they were indeed worthy of the rewards and spoils of their hard work. This attitude towards their lives have led the Somtaaw to make great strides in material sciences and geology. Kiith Naabal may have beaten them to the invention of steel, but it was Somtaaw that created alloy manufacturing and turned it into an art form. As the Mothership project began to get underway during the modern Karakid time period, Kiith Somtaaw, true to their mining specialties, were the first to conceptualize and implement the idea of asteroid mining. Not only that, they were the ones who designed and maintained the gigantic phase disassembler array aboard the scaffold, which was a device that broke down materials to their component elements to be used in the construction of the Kushan mothership. The Somtaaw started their recorded existence among the Kontala mountain range on Karak. Allegedly, the Somtaaw Kiith saw had a vision from S'Jet himself, which inspired them to rally the architects, masons, painters, and weavers to make a series of 33 temples along the mountain range from the sands of Kasar to the top of Lungma-Jin, the roof of the world. This wonder of ancient Kaarak would be called the Shimmering Path, and for 400 years it was considered a great sign of spiritual dedication to walk the path, and how far Kushan was able to travel on the trail before giving up was considered to be a test of the strength of their faith. At the last temple at the top of Lungma-Jin, a pilgrim, if they were able to make it that far, would behold one of Kiith Somtaaw's most prized possessions, the Star Metal Scrolls. They were truly sacred items that were said to have been written by Jakul himself, in a language no Kushan could understand. By the modern era, interest in the scrolls were revived with the discovery of the card Toba and the Guide Stone. However, Somtaaw had since closed the upper temples for the past 300 years by the discovery of the Guide Stone, and were seemingly intent on dragging their heels in the Diamid, who continually petitioned them to be reopened for scrutiny by modern-day scholars. Unfortunately, no investigation of the Star Metal Scrolls ever happened. The Taidani burning of Kaarak saw to that. But Kiith Somtaaw was not a religious Kiith by the modern era of Kaarak, and the transition towards a reputation for mining and geology was slow. As with most events in Kaarak's history, it started with, once again, the Heresy Wars. Somtaaw was able to avoid the worst of this conflict as the Kontala mountain ranges provided ample protection from the armies of Kiith Siidim and Kiith Gaalsien. Unfortunately, pilgrimages along the Shimmering Path dropped to almost nothing, and Somtaaw needed their money to maintain the temples. Eventually, only the first temple, the Oracle of Tala, and the last, the Dome of the World, remained open, and as the Somtaaw had no goods to trade, they became effectively isolated from the rest of the world. This would remain the same from about 675 KDS until 789 KDS, when Kura Somtaaw saw was the recipient of a strange dream. In it, she saw S'Jet himself strike a great red sword into an area of the Kontala mountain ranges that was seldom visited. Believing this to be a vision from the Great Maker, Kura ordered several Somtaaw families to begin digging in the region called Red Creek Valley, where she believed S'Jet struck his sword. What they did find was the richest iron ore that had been ever found on Kaarak, with enough to make over 100,000 swords. Quickly announcing their find to the world, Kiith's Gaalsien and Siidim offered ludicrous sums of money that would have taken care of Kiith Somtaaw's problems indefinitely, but Kura Somtaaw refused, with her exact words being, "Why should I sell these madmen a knife to cut my throat with?" Instead, Somtaaw began building their own smelters and forging their own high-quality steel. They then made a deal with Kiith Soban. In exchange for their steel, the Sobani would protect the Kasar Pass leading into their Kontala mountains for no less than 100 years, which was unheard of at the time for Soban contracts. Eventually, the Heresy Wars ended, and Kiith Somtaaw began to further their reputation as a mining Kiith. As new technologies came about, they were quick to adopt them to their mining operations, and by the time of the mothership launch, they were a proud Kiith of 500,000. Their power and influence grew so much that Somtaaw had expanded into new holdings alongside manufacturing giants like Kiith Naabal and Lirhra. They were even leading the field in asteroid mining by this time. Unfortunately though, Somtaaw debatably had one of the roughest starts to their new lives on Hiigara after the Homeworld War. By the time of the Hiigaran landfall and the awakening of the cryopod sleepers aboard the Kushan mothership, their numbers had collapsed to a paltry 15,000, mostly men. Then Kiith Naabal made its play to absorb into themselves Somtaaw and a number of other Kiithid who had suddenly found themselves with greatly diminished numbers, which would deprive these unfortunate Kiith of their sovereign rights, a voice in the Diamid, any claims to land on Hiigara, and the inability to use the mothership, now repurposed as a shipyard to make their own fleet of spaceships like the other Kiithid were doing at this time. But thanks to a coalition between them and Kiith Paktu, Somtaaw was able to stay independent and keep their status as a Kiith. Eventually, Kiith Somtaaw did gain access to the mothership shipyard, and were able to construct a space fleet of their own to pursue their fortunes in the one field they were best known for in the modern era of Kaarak: mining. But it's what happened after with Somtaaw that changed the course of their collective destiny, and what tends to interest most students of Hiigaran history: the Beast War. but that's a far more complicated topic for another day. Kiith Siidim. The self-proclaimed superiors to the other Kiithid of Kaarak. Debatably, only Kiith Gaalsien outmatches them in terms of negative public perception by the time of the Kushan mothership. They were an arrogant people, stemming from their belief in the traditional Siidim cosmology, which, as has been stated before, a belief that the Siidim were born from the stars, unlike the other Kiithid who were native to Kaarak. Therefore, the Siidim were naturally superior to their brethren. This belief then led into the heresy wars with Kiith Gaalsien, the single most destructive conflict on Kaarak. By the time it ended in 820 KDS with the siege of Matar, Kiith Siidim seemed to openly renounce their old claims of superiority. Or so the other Kushan thought. Instead, the Siidim bided their time, rebuilt their strength both militarily and politically, and rejoined the other Kiithid as visible equals for the time being. This changed in 1110 KDS with Operation Kadim, the mission that led to the discovery of the Kar Toba. During the operation, the Siidim desert carrier Sakala attempted to betray the northern Kiithid carrier Kapizi. While the events of this phase of Operation Kadim requires far more explanation, the Siidim were eventually defeated. When word got back to the northern Diamid of what the Siidim had done, they immediately censured the Kiith. The only other time afterwards Siidim would contribute to Kushan history would be after the discovery of the Guide Stone, where they offered ancient records from their own archives. However, Kiith Siidim was never allowed back into the Diamid, and by the finding of the Guide Stone, their numbers had dwindled to only 2,000 people. Many smaller families having abandoned them since their betrayal during Operation Kadim, leaving the older families clinging to their pride and decaying sense of superiority. By the time of the burning of Kaarak, a small portion of Siidim were chosen to join the Mothership project, but by the time of the Hiigaran landfall, it was realized that only 200 Siidim remained after the Homeworld War. They were now too small to be considered a proper Kiith, and were properly disbanded. In the end, Kiith Siidim was living proof that pride always leads to one's downfall. Kiith Hraal. Compared to the other Kiithid covered so far, the Hraal are young upstarts. Created shortly after the Heresy Wars and the formation of the Diamid and Tyr, Kiith Hraal would rise quickly in the field of manufacturing, particularly appliances and ground equipment, even rivaling the abilities of Kiith Naabal. They are in actuality a union of 5 different groups, and each one had their own separate traditions and culture that would come into conflict with one another. But this diversity in backgrounds and experience has also actually been proven to be a strength, as the wider field of skill sets has allowed for the Kiith as a whole to take on numerous projects in multiple disciplines, which was proven quite visibly in Kiith Hraal's history and how they found their place among the other great Kiithid of Kaarak. As mentioned earlier, Kiith Hraal started life as 5 small Kiith who wanted to avoid being absorbed by the larger Kiithid in the aftermath of the Heresy Wars. So instead of allowing their destinies to be co-opted by a group of strangers, they instead chose to come together to form one unified Kiith. When the newly elected Hraal Saw entered the new Diamid and proclaimed themselves the leader of Kiith Hraal, it was met with howls of derision from Kiith Siidim and Naabal. Who were these upstarts to stand as equals among the largest and venerated Kiithid on Kaarak? But the Sobani guards did not remove the new upstarts on orders from the Soban Saw, and after some rational discussion from the Paktu, Somtaaw, and Soban delegations, Kiith Hraal was officially recognized as a proper Kiith worthy of a place in the Diamid. But despite popular support among the other Kushans, Kiith Hraal struggled. Besides the constant legal challenges from Kiith Siidim about their existence, each Kiith had their own specialty and niche in the greater society on Kaarak. But what would be Hraal's? They were formed on the basis of survival, not common talents or skills. If they could not find their place among the Kiithid, they would simply be forced to go bankrupt and dissolve Kiith Hraal. The answer to this dilemma eluded Stel Hraal Saw for some time. However, inspiration, as it usually does, would come in the most unlikely of places. One day, Stel was touring the Naabal Ironworks, as S'Jet supervisors were trying to advise Naabal artisans on how to create steam cars unsuccessfully. As they argued with each other, the Hraal Saw realized something. The S'Jet people and the Naabal people were wildly different in terms of culture and tradition and how they generally do things, which in turn made cooperation extraordinarily difficult as what she had just witnessed. Of course, the Hraal couldn't match the scientific knowledge or engineering acumen of Kiith S'Jet and Naabal respectively, but they did have them beat on one aspect. the ability to work together as individuals with different backgrounds and talents. So she begun work quickly, using up the last of the Kiith's money to buy the manufacturing rights for the Naabal steam car. By the time of the next triad on Khaaneph, representatives from Kiith S'Jet and Naabal watched in wonder as 40 Hraal laborers put together 3 steam cars in a single day. An extremely impressive achievement, especially when it would take the other Kiiths a month to do the same. What Stel Hraal saw and her Kiith had done was use the wide variety of disciplines in the members of her Kiith, and broke down the complicated manufacture of the steam car into simpler tasks that could be performed by each person. This innovation was the very first assembly line on Khaaneph, and from those humble beginnings they became host to the largest manufacturing yards in all of Khaaneph, which specialized in domestic appliances and equipment. Truly, they had come into their own, and in doing so, could stand as proud equals to the other major Kiithid. But during the time of the Mothership project, a schism would occur within the ranks of Kiith Hraal. Many were fascinated by the potential of aerospace manufacturing and engineering, but the Kiith leadership wanted to stay with their traditional ground manufacturing roots. So those put off by the Kiith's dedication to staying the course left, joining another Kiith that specialized in making sand sailors and other craft, Kiith Lear. However, the number of new joinees to Lear caused a name change, Kiith Learha. At the end of the Homeworld War, Kiith Hraal, like many other Kiithid, would find their numbers greatly depleted. Instead of continuing on as Kiith Hraal, the survivors chose to join Kiith Learha. Kiith Kaalel. No, not the superhero. Kiith Kaalel is an existing contradiction. They are both expert entertainers and performers that rival the Manani, but also crafty spies and saboteurs. This reputation of theirs started before the Heresy Wars. What is known is that they originated from a single man known as Kaalel the Seer, a wandering desert prophet. He claimed that he could see visions of the gods dancing in the stars, and that one day they would return from the sky and lift them into heaven. Those who chose to follow this seemingly madman became Kiith Kaalel. As their Kiith began to establish themselves, they began to garner a reputation as great entertainers and actors. Stage plays by Kiith Kaalel were supposed to have brought audiences from many cities away, with each performance being unique to the others that preceded it. Their work was considered by many Kushan to be one of the great treasures of the ancient world. However, this changed radically when the Heresy Wars began to get underway, and the Kaalel began to make a new home on the fringes of society, evading any kind of public attention whenever possible. Perhaps, much like Kiith's Paktu and Manaan, the Gaalsien did not like their unorthodox ways, and Kiith Kaalel chose instead to keep to the shadows. Kiith Gaalsien even tried to actively search for the Kaalel with their armies, but when they found their settlement on the shores of the area known as the Powdered Sands, it was as if the population simply vanished, leaving behind only their possessions and structures, which caused the Gaalsien to accuse Kiith Kaalel of practicing witchcraft. By the modern Khaaneph era, there was still no explanation for this accomplishment. Witchcraft or not, their ability to stay hidden was so great that some families of Kiith Kaalel were actually unaware of the existence of the others. This led to a mildly amusing event where when the new Diamond was formed after the conclusion of the Heresy Wars, 3 Kiith Saws came forward to represent their clan. But time marches on, and as it does, and over the course of the centuries, the Kaalel went back to their roots as entertainers and performers, and as communications technology became more widespread, the Kaalel became the front-running specialists in this growing field. However, there was more to this than just a Kiith simply finding its specialty in the changing times. By 1113 KDS, a S'Jet analyst actually found hidden signals in Kaalel broadcasts that were actually part of an intelligence network they had been running for centuries. Apparently, Kiith Kaalel had chosen to take on a third specialty, intelligence gathering and espionage. In fact, up until the Mothership launch, Kiith Kaalel maintained their intelligence network quite thoroughly, and their skills in these areas even outmatched the warriors of Kiith Soban. Perhaps due to these accomplishments, many Kaalel found themselves an integral part of fleet special operations aboard the Kushan Mothership during the Homeworld War. Kiith Tamber. Originally desert shamans and fortune tellers, they were among the many Kiithid who found themselves the targets of Kiith Siidim during the Heresy Wars, causing them to flee to the hidden Naabali city of Tyr in 621 KDS. With their new start, Kiith Tamber began to specialize in medicines and pharmaceuticals, becoming one of the leading Kiithid in medicine, but by the time of the Guidestone's discovery, they had switched their specialty to micro-miniature surgery. A mere 12 members of Tambur made it onto the gold list of those chosen to join the mothership's journey in cryosleep. Unfortunately, the burning of Kaarak wiped out the rest of the Kiith, and by the time of the Kushan landfall, there was only one Tambur left: Ifrit Tambur. Taidani attacks during the Homeworld War caused irreparable damage to many cryotrays, killing their occupants as they slept, which included the rest of Ifrit's Kiith, and his wife who slept in the pod next to him. In Ifrit's grief and rage, he declared power on the Taidan Empire, a vow of eternal vengeance. Out of respect for the ancient tradition, the Hiigaran Diamid gave him a small frigate to pursue his justice. Over time, Ifrit would become the most famous bounty hunter in the Hiigaran section of the galaxy, claiming over 300 Taidan war criminals. He would also develop a following and attract other displaced Kiith members who wished to join in his crusade. Kiith S'Jet. By the time of the Heresy Wars, Kiith S'Jet was simply a Kiith specializing in transportation and caravans. But as the wars began to intensify, they pledged their allegiance to Kiith S'Jet, becoming their vassals. Over the next 300 years, the S'Jeti, either knowingly or unknowingly, influenced the S'Jet to also specialize in archaeology, alongside their previous skills in vehicle manufacture, although their achievements in the field of archaeology never compared to their success with vehicle construction. That changed with the discovery of the Kar Toba in 1110 KDS. Kiith S'Jet worked hard excavating the former prison ship, even after the other Kiith had lost interest and stopped devoting resources to uncovering its secrets. Around 30 years after its discovery, Mevath S'Jet was given directorship over the Kar Toba site, and single-handedly she found something that would disrupt the Kushan society to its core: the Guidestone, the map to Hiigara. Over time, Kiith S'Jet would grow to embrace the field of archaeology more so, becoming experts in uncovering the lost history of the Kushan people. But they were never a large Kiith, and by the time of the mothership launch, a mere 600 were chosen to join the journey in cryosleep. And after the Hiigaran landfall, they were forced to become vassals of Kiith S'Jet again in order to maintain their existence. Kiith Hraal. Originally they were Kiith Lear, who were an offshoot of Kiith Manaan. Lear specialized in the creation of sand sailors to cross the deserts of Kaarak, and eventually moved on to vehicles of all kinds, often those with an emphasis on speed. Once Kushan society entered the era of flight, the Lear moved into aircraft construction, making luxurious, high-speed aircraft for private buyers. Then as the eyes of Kushan civilization moved further upward into aerospace, Kiith Lear chose to broaden their field of interest yet again, but this time they would be joined by scientists and engineers from Kiith Hraal who believed in the same vision of the future that Lear did. And with this union, Kiith Lear became Kiith Hraal, and they would move on to become masters of aerospace technology alongside Kiith Naabal. By the time of the mothership launch, many Lear Hraal served in support and technical positions throughout the Homeworld War. And after the landfall in Hiigara, the now decimated Kiith Hraal were brought into Lear Hraal's ranks. Kiith Hraal. Once they were among the mighty religious Kiithid of the ancient era on Kaarak before the Heresy Wars. But when that conflict arose, Hraal sided with Kiith Siidim against the Gaalsien, under the mistaken in hindsight assumption that two religious Kiithid versus the one would result in a decisive victory. But that didn't happen, and by the 700s KDS, Hraal's power was noticeably declining, with their degrading state coming to a head by the Battle of Danak in 811 KDS. During that battle, Kiith Hraal rallied their largest army to assist the Siidim in repulsing a large-scale attack by Naabali soldiers. But the Siidim forces never came, and Hraal's men were slaughtered. In their greatly weakened state, Kiith Hraal was absorbed into Kiith Siidim, but not all were happy with this turn of events, and there were even long-standing accusations against the Siidim leadership, blaming them for their lack of support during the Battle of Danak, so they could weaken Hraal and take their holdings. By the end of the Heresy Wars, Hraal was only a memory. Kiith Jiraki. A small-scale Kiith who specialized in telescopes and optical technology. As said technology became more advanced, they moved into the fields of sensors and satellite systems. History would have easily passed them by were it not for Lakab Jiraki, who found the Jiraki object, otherwise known as the primary anomaly, which were names for the Kartoba before it was discovered that it was the Kartoba. Eager to capitalize on the fact that one of their own found the Kartoba, Kiith Jaraki attempted to make him a public figure, the face of a new campaign to place more satellites in orbit to explore the Karak system for more potential discoveries. But they never became a large Kiith, with only a handful of their people being placed in cryosleep aboard the Kushan mothership, while others served as sensor specialists. During the Homeworld War, it was Jaraki members who first spotted the Kadeshi mothership in the Great Nebula. After the war and the Hiigaran landfall, they were absorbed into Kiith S'Jet. Interestingly enough though, 75 years after landfall, they would split off from the S'Jeti to form their own Kiith again, and much like during their time on Karak, Jaraki went back to specializing in sensors and signals technology, but this time with a distinct leaning towards progenitor sciences. Khaaneph. No mention of the Kiithid system in general would technically be complete without mentioning the Khaaneph. The word itself, Khaaneph, is literally translated to godless, and is derived from an ancient term used by the Gaalsien as one of the code words for their enemies. This is particularly interesting as the Gaalsien mind was unable to conceive of beings that would completely shun the existence of S'Juk entirely, as to not believe in the Great Maker is to literally believe in nothing. No laws, justice, Kiith. They were practically wild animals masquerading as Kushans. Even the other Kiithid to the Gaalsien are considered to be lost brothers and sisters who have been led dangerously astray, to whom they call Fagan, or Fagani in the Gaalsien dialects, which translates to blind followers of a false god. To the Gaalsien, that is quite a drastic difference to those who believe in no god at all. They were discovered by accident in 1024 KDS when cryptographer Masar Manaan was poring over Gaalsien transmissions for a report he was to make to his superiors about Gaalsien code words. In his research, he found two recurring terms in their communications, Fagan and Khaaneph. The Northern Coalition of Kiithid at the time for the former, and the latter being referenced as some third faction out in the deepest regions of the desert, where even the Gaalsien feared to go. So Masar pressed on, and 3 years of painstaking research later, he found what the Khaaneph were. They were victims of Kiith Siidim's anti-Grittidim policies in the ancient era of Karak. Like many of their kind, they were displaced from their homes and found shelter in other Kiithid or elsewhere. The groups who became the Khaaneph, however, chose a different path: the deep desert. Many perished in the unforgiving environment, while others eked out a living by scavenging the numerous battlefields created by the Heresy Wars. And when the wars ended and the conflicts died down, they would turn on each other just to survive. For the Khaaneph had no guiding principles, no history, no loyalty, just a need for basic survival. As time went on, the rest of Karak entered the Age of Reason. The Khaaneph would continue their attacks on outlying settlements and assaults upon unguarded caravans. They still continued these raiding operations against the other Kiithid, and presumably the Gaalsien, well up until the time of Operation Kadim in 1110 KDS. It was theorized by some within the Northern Coalition of Kiithid at the time that a direct conflict with the Khaaneph was inevitable. However, there is no mention of such a conflict in the time between Operation Kadim and the burning of Karak, so it's unknown if the other Kiithid and the Khaaneph ever met on the field of battle. It is likely to assume that the Khaaneph were wiped out in their entirety upon the burning of Karak. The Hiigaran-Kushans are undoubtedly a culturally rich and truly unique people with limitless potential, who have time and again overcome enormous obstacles. Whatever awaits them in the future, it is clear the sun has yet to set on them as a people, and even if it were to do so, their achievements will live on through eternity as legends.